and welcome back to day 3 of the Tortoise COVID inquiry. I'm Liz Mosley. I'm the editor for the penultimate session, where we're going to try and unpick some of the gendered aspects of how the pandemic has played out. What we know, of course, is that the disease itself has, I believe, killed more men than it has killed women, but there are a whole range of other gendered elements, some of which we've talked about and reported on at Tortoise Through the Year. We've looked at, for example, the relative performance of male leaders of countries versus female leaders of countries. We've reported on the enormous rise in cases of domestic abuse and domestic violence that happened through both lockdowns, the first and then more recently in the November lockdown in this country. We've talked a lot about the decimation of jobs in sectors like retail and hospitality. We've talked about closures of schools and the crisis in childcare. And there was a number of things that were raised in the NHS session earlier on that mentioned things like the effect on women's health services, pregnancy services, these kinds of things. So we're joined by a number of experts today who will try and help us to crack open those things. And as always, I'm very keen to hear personal experiences, responses and witness statements from people here. My colleague Claudia is in the chat today and she'll be able to sort of liaise with you and understand what it is you'd like to contribute. So please do that. But as is common with our, as is the case with our inquiry sessions, as distinct from a normal thinking, we will start with opening remarks by a lawyer. In this case, Jeremy Breyer is here with us, who's prepared just one statement, the sort of for and against this question as to whether the government's handling of the COVID pandemic through deliberate choices has in some way disadvantaged that small and insignificant part of the population whose name is called women. So Jeremy, if you're there, could I hand to you please to do the opening statement, please? Hi there. Thank you for being here.
Hi Liz, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you well, thank you.
Well, thanks Liz, it's a real honour to open this incredibly important session and to set out some of the issues to be discussed. I'm a barrister and I also sit from time to time as a judge in the Crown Courts. And when lockdown began in March, my first thought turned to some of the people I see before me in the courts. People caught in cycles of crime and addiction, people in homes which are not homes, which are ill-equipped for sustained periods of confinement. And above all, vulnerable women and children in small spaces with abusive men, trapped not just in their own homes, but also by reason of there being a closure of the outside world, the world of escape, of friends, of support services, trapped outside their own communities and extended families and support structures. And it seems to me that any meaningful inquiry into the effects of COVID-19 and lockdown needs to start here, or at least needs to focus on this point at its core. Because if a government and effectively a society is condemning some of our most vulnerable citizens to a life of greater fear, greater chance of injury, and let's be frank, a greater chance of death, can this ever be justified in the name of protecting society at large from a virus? And a virus which, whilst incredibly serious, does not have a particularly high death rate amongst those who are neither elderly nor have pre-existing conditions. Domestic abuse can of course affect men, but there's no doubt that women are afflicted in greater numbers and more acutely. So did a one-size-fits-all blanket policy hit women the hardest in this respect? Or was it the only way? The government's website acknowledges the problem. It says, The government acknowledges that coronavirus household isolation instructions can cause anxiety for those who are experiencing or feel at risk of domestic abuse. There is never an excuse for domestic abuse, no matter what the circumstances are. Well, in these mundane bureaucratic tones, the government seemed to combine two understatements of the obvious. Domestic abuse causes far more than anxiety, and it's not just inexcusable, it's a criminal offence of potentially very considerable severity. So when I read the advice on this point, look out for the signs, spot the signs, call the helplines, what I think is, well, how on earth are you going to do that when everyone's in lockdown? The policies of isolation and confinement have led to increased levels of domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence. And isn't it a simple fact? And I hope a fact that this session will explore or challenge that vulnerable women were foreseen collateral in our blanket approach to COVID-19. And this is a thing that I think is important because policies haven't always been targeted, and perhaps they couldn't be. But there's been no real attempt, as I believe perhaps there should have been, to promote the shielding of the elderly and vulnerable, but to allow the majority of the working age population and children to lead more normal lives. Because when we think about the burden falling heavily on women, it isn't just about domestic abuse. I want to talk about other things. I want to talk about pregnancy. We've all heard tales from friends, from family of mothers giving birth alone. No one there to hold her hand, to share the joy and the pain. Is that single additional visitor to hospital, even if it minutely increased the risk of a local COVID spread, even with all the protective equipment, wasn't that worth it so that that mother would have someone to be with? COVID-19 is having catastrophic secondary impacts on the health of women and girls around the world as well. Decisions made at every level of the response to the pandemic are resulting in women being further cut off from sexual and reproductive health services, threatening sharp rises in maternal and neonatal mortality. We saw this in the West Africa Ebola outbreak of 2014 to 16. Thousands of lives were lost when safe delivery, neonatal and family planning services became inaccessible due to the outbreak. And whilst it's true that men are more likely to die from COVID, women have been economically hit the hardest. Mothers were 50% more likely to have lost or resigned their jobs than fathers. Women are more likely to have been furloughed, less likely to have been hired, and young women in particular are disproportionately likely to work in industries that have been decimated by lockdown. Homeschooling was a low point of most parents' years. I learned that perhaps I wasn't quite the patient, careful teacher that I'd always assumed I would be. But I think, on balance, the burden fell heaviest on women's shoulders. A piece of research by the University of London in June found that 63% of women considered that they did most of the homeschooling, with just 13% saying their partner did. Was it mums who were left to sacrifice their careers and attend to the needs of the family? None of this is to judge families. Families may have needed to prioritise the breadwinner in strained times. But then that perhaps begs the question again, why it is in so many families in 2020 that women are still second to their partners in financial terms. Was it coronavirus policies that hit women economically? Or was it really just socioeconomic trends which coronavirus exacerbated? So this session is all about the impact of COVID-19 on women. It touches upon a range of social and economic questions, and they are difficult ones that three fantastic women are going to address in a moment. And this session, of course, has been opened by me as a man in the interest of diversity. But I want to leave you with one final thought, and perhaps it's a certain embarrassment, about the fact that we've had largely male leaders, and certainly in visibility terms, largely male scientists, making what I would delicately suggest have been poor, unfocused and inconsistent decisions, which directly impact on women and children in an unfair and unnecessary manner. I wonder, had we had an Angela Merkel, a Sanna Marin, or, dare I say it, a Theresa May in charge, would this country have handled things better?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. A good and comprehensive sweep of the various different ways in to this question that we're going to tackle. I'm going to come in a second to Janaya Walker from Southall Black Sisters to open up the conversation in the same way that you did your statement, specifically about the point about domestic abuse. Just one thing to say, which is unfortunately Joanne Robertson from the Young Women's Trust has been unable to join us today because the COVID is in her child's nursery, so she now has to do the childcare. So exactly to your point, she has been affected directly by the thing that's been happening to so many of us throughout. But happily, we have a colleague of hers, Joe, who is a man, to gamely step in at the last minute. So we'll come and look particularly on the impact on young women in a second. But if I can start, please, with Janaya. Janaya, you head up legal and policy and campaigning for Southall Black Sisters. For those people that don't know, Southall Black Sisters offers frontline services to Black women in particular who are experiencing domestic abuse. And that opening of Jeremy's, it sort of gave us, it sort of implied or suggested that the sort of one size fits all isolation and confinement policy has sort of consciously decided that women who are at risk in their own homes are a price worth paying. Is that your sense too?
Absolutely. And I think that combined with the fact that there didn't seem to be any drawing on existing knowledge in terms of globally about the fact that, you know, whether they're talking about natural disasters or wars, in times of crises, if there aren't policies or if there isn't forward thinking to mitigate the problem, we are likely to see, and we see time and time again, an increased risk of harm to women and to children in terms of gender-based violence, which was exactly what organisations on the ground were anticipating when we were looking at February, March, and there were discussions about an impending lockdown, was really looking for, okay, so given what we know over years of evidence, what is the plan? How are we going to respond to what we can see is a mounting crisis? And what was devastating was that there was no crisis plan.
There was no plan. I had to go back and piece together a little bit of the sort of the steps in what the government called its provisions to support people affected by this. And the sort of the beginning of the lockdown, sort of in the springtime, there was a £750 million boost to charities, it was called, of which some of that was, you said, oh, you know, that domestic abuse charities will have a shout to that. That was the 8th of April. Then on the 11th of April, just a few days later, there was Priti Patel's You Are Not Alone campaign kind of went live, and there was a notional £2 million attached to that. I don't know if it was the same pot of money or whatever. And then on the 2nd of May, a further 75 million was announced, of which 28 in theory was ring fenced for domestic abuse charities. What would be really helpful to understand is, like you just said in your response just now, that organisations on the ground, and this is the nature of domestic abuse help, it is small organisations on the ground with local reach, like the one that you work for. I'm interested to know, of that sort of large, the lots of large numbers, was it adequate, and could you get it? How did it make its way to you, or did it?
Yeah, I think it's important firstly to clarify is that, and there was some confusion even for frontline organisations as to, you know, of this pot of money, what was the new announcement, and of that announcement, what was specifically for the violence against women and girls sector? Because I think there were a series of announcements that sounded as though they were new pots of money. So the 750, and then the 75, and then the 28, that was all one announcement, as it were. It was almost just trickled out over a period of time. So 28 million was the eventual allocation that came to the violence against women and girls sector out of the broader 750 million.
Okay,
and I think you rightly highlighted that those announcements came after the lockdown period, which was an incredibly difficult thing for organisations to address, especially smaller specialist services supporting Black and minoritized women, as you'd said, because that crisis planning, the transfer transferal of services from frontline services to remote working, the operation of helplines, all of those things had to be done prior to any funding reaching the services. And it was many weeks after the funding was announced that it eventually came through to organisations. So there's a number of smaller organisations who wouldn't have been able to bear the brunt of that, and where that delay would have been much too late. And of course, ultimately, for the services that are closing, for the services that can't operate to their full capacity, that all means that there are more and more women who are seeking help, and that there's nowhere for them to go.
Yeah, you get a sort of double problem, which is a huge increase in demand coming off the back of already a real depression of services, because I'm guessing that because of the social distancing guidelines, services that would otherwise have been available, did they close? Was there a contraction as well as an increase in demand, I suppose?
Absolutely, that's exactly it. There's a combination where the demand ramps up, and at the same time many of the frontline services and face-to-face services shut down or go remotely. For South All Black Sisters in particular, we run a service where a lot of the support that we offer to women is through the service itself. It's almost a hub for women who can, you know, drop in on their way home if they need to, or they're referred by a friend through word of mouth. They may not have access to Wi-Fi or anything to come to us remotely. Yeah. So it's moving all of those services, our English classes, our support group classes, our sort of divorce advice surgeries, all to online telephone counselling in an incredibly short amount of time. And we're very aware that there are many women who in that contraction will have, you know, lost the support that they needed in that time, and that would have been replicated across the UK.
When you said before, Janaya, that there was no crisis plan, but learnings from X many years beforehand, there could have been one, sort of a sense that we know what we should have done, or that we could have put these things in place. What are some of those things that should have been there that weren't?
I think some of them, well, firstly, just to begin with, I think the communication with the violence against women and girls sector was incredibly poor. It was almost the information that the public were receiving in terms of what they could do was the same for the violence against women and girls sector. It wasn't that we were getting any advanced information. We were looking for there to be a real tie-in, for example, with people like the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, the Victims Commissioner in the kind of COVID crisis planning meetings. Certainly, a surge of funding in advance of lockdown to prepare for what services would have had to do to transition to remote services. And particularly before lockdown took place, a really clear message to women and to the general public, to abusers, that there would continue to be places for people to go, that abuse would not be tolerated, that these are the helplines that you can reach out to, and here are the ways that you may be exempt from some of the wider restrictions if you feel unsafe. Unfortunately, what we saw was some of that came after, and in the weeks after lockdown. And unfortunately, what we know now is that particularly in the 2 weeks after lockdown was announced was where we saw the real rise, particularly in domestic homicides. So there's no doubt that it was much too late.
Thanks, Janaya. That's a horrible but helpful opening to the conversation. I'm going to come now, if I can, to Jo. Jo is Director of Communications and Campaigns at the Young Women's Trust, who's stepping in for Joanne. Are you there, Jo? Can I hear and see you? I hope you are.
Hi there.
Hello, hi Jo. Jo Levinson has gamely stepped in at short notice, so thank you so much for doing that. The Young Women's Trust, obviously, we sort of rather facetiously said at the beginning of this session, we're just talking about that small proportion of the population which is called women. Now, the Young Women's Trust specifically talks about women and supports women who are aged 18 to 30. Just out of interest, how many people are we talking about that fall into that category?
Sure, morning. So we're talking about around 5.5 million women in England and Wales are aged 18 to 30. So that's a group, fundamentally, we have an interest with Young Women's Trust, but we've got a particular interest in those young women who are struggling to live on low or no pay. And sadly, they're the ones who were already finding life difficult before the coronavirus crisis hit. And since then, their problems, their financial problems, their social problems, their mental health problems have just exacerbated.
So why is it that young women in particular are sort of uniquely vulnerable? have been this year uniquely vulnerable? What's the sort of cocktail of factors that makes that group particularly problematic?
I think it's been a perfect storm. So as I said, even before the coronavirus crisis, young women were paid less than young men. They were more likely to be in insecure employment if they did have jobs, more likely to have been offered 0 hours contracts, more likely to have been discriminated in the workplace than men, and more likely to have mental health problems, more likely to be carrying the burden of unpaid caring responsibilities for their children, family members, friends, other people in the community. And those issues haven't gone away. What we've seen since March, so in the last 9 months, is that actually those situations have accentuated and the support available has massively diminished. So our own research at Young Women's Trust has found that about 750,000 young women have had to come into work during the pandemic, despite safety concerns they had, and that's a higher number than for men. We found out that 1.5 million young women have lost income since the pandemic. And we're not talking about wealthy people. We're talking about people where actually a pound not in their pocket makes a big difference. We're talking about 3 million young women who say they're now worried about their mental health, a massive increase, and that's over half of that population of young women. So these are really serious issues, and I think young women have got every right to feel they've been let down in the last 9 months, let alone the years before that.
When we spoke briefly this morning, Jo, you made what I think is an important point about, and James, has been a sort of repeated refrain actually at Tortoise, that the pandemic has revealed more than it's changed. I think this is particularly true with this question of both domestic abuse and young women in particular, because we were discussing this morning about, funnily enough, in relation to Joanne having to go off to look after her toddler, that there's very little statutory provision anyway for carers leave in this country. And obviously, even if the school is open and your child is sent home because somebody's got COVID and they do a bubble thing and they shut it down, it is mums who've been disproportionately sort of walloped by where you've got to stay home and cook somebody lunch and make sure that they're all right and everything else. So do we have a sense of how that is playing out now, even since the schools closed? With the schools closing in the first place was walloped women pretty hard, I think. But even now, do we have a sense of how that is panning out?
We do, and you're absolutely right that the sort of first lockdown and school closures and closures of early year settings affected parents up and down the country, but particularly women who bear the burden or carry most of the responsibility of caring responsibilities. Not only could they not rely on their schools or early years providers, but they weren't allowed to count on informal childcare, which so many people rely on. And I think it's very telling that if you look at the chronology actually of as things started to open up, people could hire a nanny in their own homes way before they could use informal childcare via a childcare bubble. So well-off people could have a nanny in their own homes. I think that's about the same time you're allowed to go shooting or hunting or fishing. And yet somebody who wanted to use a family member or friends for childcare, caring for a family member, wasn't allowed to. And even now we've got fortunately there are arrangements in place. There are something called a childcare bubble where you can team up with one other household to mutually provide childcare support. But that's still insufficient for many people. And you're right. I mean, the lack of statutory provision and particularly paid provision for parents has been poor for a long time. I mean, those of us who are lucky enough to work for enlightened employers, and I count Young Women's Trust absolutely as a very enlightened employer, are fortunate we're able to count on paid leave for all sorts of things. Lots of people can't. All parents are entitled to some dependence leave, but that's for emergencies and that's unpaid. Parents can access parental leave up until a child is 18. I think it's up to 18 weeks, but again, that is unpaid. And very interestingly, if you have to self-isolate because your child has been taken out of school because of a COVID case in their bubble, in England, and I think Wales at the moment, you are not entitled to any support. Interestingly, Scotland is leading the way. From Monday, if you are a low-income person who is on benefits, you will be entitled to a self-isolation grant if your child is sent home. And that's something we'd love to see take place in England. It would really help many parents.
Thanks, Jo. I wonder, one thing that I think we should perhaps piece together really deliberately in our work on this inquiry is the chronology. So just a short, because even though the title of this session is whether women have been sort of dismissed and neglected and ignored, I wonder if one of the things is that they've just sort of been forgotten, because some of the announcements, as you say, it does come, but it comes after too late, which suggests that the people who are a single mum living by herself, somebody who hasn't got the income, somebody who is living in an abusive relationship, they're just not figuring in the thinking until after somebody puts their hand up and goes, oh, sorry, could you just clarify what's the state of play for us? Even in the very, very beginning, I think it took 36 hours. I don't live with my children, they live with their dad. I think it was about 36 hours before the guidance was, oh, yes, you can go and pick your kids up from their other house. Things like that. It's sort of, and that's not a small number of people in that situation. It would be worth us going through and just seeing how many weeks, how many days was it before the government said, oh yeah, if you live by yourself with your children, they don't count as the person that you can go for a walk with. You can pick another grown-up. I know it seems like a small thing, but it just feels like that was missing. Do you think that's fair?
It's absolutely the case. I mean, it's a fair assertion and completely unfair that has been the case. You're absolutely right. When there have been considerations given, it's been off the back of lobbying, and it's been too little and late. And we keep doing the same. And I think this goes to the heart, actually, of the government's response to the coronavirus crisis. I think it mirrors the fact that lots of groups in society were overlooked and had been overlooked for a long time. And we're also seeing that even now. So at Young Women's Trust, we're very aware day in, day out of the devastating impact that the economic and social and health fallout of the coronavirus crisis is having on young women and many other people in society. But there's still a real lack of really good, strong data. And the government is still not doing enough to collect real-time data on how different groups are being affected. It's really hard to get those breakdowns. You're lucky if you get, unemployment or redundancy stats for women, let alone by age, let alone by ethnicity, let alone by disability. And you need to understand a problem before you can address it. And I think at the moment, actually, with all the will in the world, the government isn't able to truly understand the nature and the extent and the rapidly changing nature of the problem, because it isn't getting a hand on the data. It's not doing enough to listen to charities and other organisations that support those who most need support. And it's not listening firsthand to those people, in our case, young women, who speak so articulately, eloquently and powerfully from their own personal experience about how the coronavirus crisis is affecting them, but how the government response is making it so much worse, which is unnecessary.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you very much. I'm going to come to Mandu Reid, who's the leader of the Women's Equality Party now. And I'd love to, after that, bring in Hannah Roberts, who's been talking in the chat about her experiences of sort of having to do everything. And also, I think it's Yulia Dimitris, who's shared an experience of trying to help somebody in a domestic violence situation. So if Mandu is there, are you there? Can we see and hear you?
I'm here, yes.
Hello, hi, nice to see you.
You too.
So just listening to Joe just now, this is where representation really matters, this sense that it's an afterthought how a policy decision, whether it's one size fits all, isolate in your homes, or how we structure the job support scheme when we wind up furlough, affect women in particular. Do you have a sense? It's hard to know who is in those COBRA meetings, and if there is a woman there, it's hard to tell that stuff.
Yeah, I think there's multiple things going on. I think on the one hand, there is dereliction of duty. On the other hand, I think there is also willful neglect. As Jeremy outlined, I do think that some of what's going on here is decisions being taken that accept that certain categories of people are acceptable collateral for what is unfolding. That the conditions within which those types of decisions get made are definitely entrenched by having quite a homogenous group of people who dominate the environments, the rooms, the corridors of power whereby these decisions get taken. Yes, transparency is an issue. It's really difficult to find out who the current, and it's a floating membership, the current membership of SAGE is. We do know that the so-called war cabinet, I think it's significant that they call themselves a war cabinet, is for sort of dudes. Priti Patel's not even allowed around the table in the mix where those decisions actually get taken. And so I think representation is absolutely one factor. When you have people who have a narrow perspective on the world, in sole charge of how things get analyzed and decided. You are setting yourself up for a situation where huge swathes of the population are going to be marginalized and left out. And I think it's, in a way, this is a question of political choices. It's a question of ideological choices. The government has shown how they are able to act and mobilize rapid spending at scale in this crisis. So what we've got in front of us is not a query around can they or can't they do the right thing? It is will they or won't they? Mm-hmm. And having more women and people from different backgrounds around the table would start to shift the dial towards them perhaps actually making different and better choices. But we have a problem really with the frame that is being used. And this is a frame that's applied to how economic decisions are taken, how social policy decisions are taken. I promise you, we would make very, very different decisions if our starting point when analyzing and modeling what to do in these situations shifted from being who or what is profiting to who or what is being exploited, who or what will suffer, who or what will be disadvantaged if we take this course of action. If you flip the way you make these decisions and analyze what course of action you take, you will notice whether there are categories of people who need to be considered. The next question, though, is are you going to do anything about it or not when you notice that these things are going to happen and be side effects of the course of action that you're taking?
When we were all afraid in March, when this really felt just terrifying and the daily death rates were going up, and it was a really horrible time and strange, really. And I may be unusual, I don't know, that we sort of have come to just kind of live with it now, and we don't remember to say the numbers of people who've died on a daily basis. This is sort of an odd absorption, adaptation into our ways of living. And those big calls, really big calls, were being made by the government. I remember having a disagreement, actually, mild one, friendly disagreement with one of my colleagues at Tortoise, who was saying, I'm angry, this is not good enough. This is, it all straight away. And I was like, oh, they didn't realize this was going to happen. They're doing their best. Can you imagine what a nightmare it is? Give them a bit of a break. In that moment back then, when it all just seemed so mad and so insane, do you think it is, I don't know if I want to say fair or reasonable or understandable, maybe, that you're thinking hundreds, potentially thousands of people are dying. We don't know who they are or who it's going, we need to do something major. Is it understandable that, for example, to Janaea's point, women in dangerous situations in their homes wouldn't have been front and center in that conversation?
No, it is completely unjustified. Janaea partly touched on this because she made the point that we had forewarning. We saw the domestic abuse situation peaking and spiking in China. That was several weeks ahead of us having to deal with the same problem on our shores. We saw it happen in Spain, in Italy, in France, creeping closer and closer to us, yet we have this situation whereby when it's on our front line, we act as if we've been ambushed. I will only accept that argument perhaps for China. They were the ones who were dealing with this first and foremost before there was any template of how this crisis manifests elsewhere. So I do not accept that. The other reason why I do not accept it is because there are other countries in the world who were facing a similar catastrophe with a similar degree of warning about how it would unfold. And they responded in a way that actually, didn't result in some of the extreme consequences that women are now going to have to deal with the legacy of. So I don't accept it, actually. I think that, which when you look at it from that perspective, that the dereliction of duty arguments really come to the fore. So no, I don't have any generosity or gentleness in the context of there being plenty of time to have a look at what is happening, what's unfolding, and to learn from the mistakes and also the positive responses that were developed in other parts of the world. I came to the tortoise session you held with Tony Blair in the early days of the crisis. One of the things he said, and I mean, I've got issues with Tony Blair on certain matters, but one of the things he said is that the minute he saw this taking place in China, he would have established a task force to scrutinize and learn as much as possible about what was going on, what was unfolding in these countries. So we were on the front, as on the front foot as we could be by the time it reached us here in Britain.
Yeah, it's a very compelling point. It was not an ambush, and arguably it's not a case of looking, hindsight doesn't start now or in August or in July. Hindsight should have been absolutely in evidence in the pandemic preparedness and in January and all the rest of it. It didn't. It wasn't an ambush.
And also, can I just point to our leader, right? There was a complacency that was on display. Do you remember the press conference? Yeah, I'm in the hospital shaking hands with coronavirus patients, and you should do the same. What the hell is that? And that is a press conference that is the main mouthpiece for giving advice to the public about how they should deal with what is unfolding. And I think that, for me, really epitomizes the complacency, the hubris, and the neglect that was at the heart and continues, to be honest, to be at the heart of how this crisis is being handled. And women, frankly, are at the sharp end in ways that we have only scratched the surface of. We are still at the prologue of how this crisis is going to affect women in the, the epilogue is not going to be pretty, because we're only now seeing the economic fallout from the decisions that were made about virus control. And it runs really, really deep, and it runs so deep for women that, we have to shift out of this mindset of continuing to have blind spots around how women in particular, are being affected.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mandu. I'm going to bring in, if I can now, some contributions from people who are wanting to make witness statements in the room. I think I'll start, if I can, with Hannah Roberts. Then I'd like to talk to Julia, I think that's how I pronounce your name, and then Elizabeth Diafero, if we can. So let's see if we can find. Are you there, Hannah?
Hi.
Hiya. Hello. You were making some interesting comments early on in the session about how basically it just all gets dumped on you/us.
Yeah, I think that women are uniquely resilient creatures and have been since the dawn of time. And consequently, we tend to take on a lot, and then we reach a point where actually, I'm at the point of, overload is just not even the right word for it. But if you see during the course of this lockdown, I think the first thing I cannot understand is how we've ended up in a situation where we have the most misogynistic, frankly, woefully inept idiot running the country at a time when what we really need is a leader. And we need somebody who thinks about the fact that women and children are going to die because of the actions that this government are taking. And I think that it makes me very angry. I have a gym business, it's a fitness business, and I've refused to close during the last lockdown because in the first lockdown, we lost a client. She committed suicide because she just couldn't cope with the weight. And I get it. I fully understand that you are a mother, you're a cook, you're a cleaner, I have my own business, so I have to come in here and be strong for all of the team. But how this is affecting the young women who work for me is a true travesty. And I find it insane that it hasn't been considered before now, that we are the ones whose activity levels fall off a cliff when anything happens. We are the ones that are experiencing moderate to severe depression. The prescription of sleeping pills that is going up through the roof because women, you naturally can't sleep. I don't think I've slept since like late February. It's madness. And yet we do hold it all together. Until what? Until the point when we crack, and then the NHS is going to be in some serious trouble here because we're all going to be headed straight for A&E and then straight for some mental institution that's not going to exist anymore because the government will have cut all of the funding for it.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you for your contribution. If we can go to Julia next, who has a story of somebody in particular that you helped you? You were required to draw on services like the one that Janaya represents, South Horrifying Sister. Would you just let us know how that all came about? What happened to you?
Yeah, hi. So in August, I met this young woman, and I wasn't really doing anything. I was just made redundant at the time, so everything was really new and so on. But I've randomly met this young woman who I found out was going through a really serious case of domestic violence. So at the time, police had been involved for about 3 weeks, and her she had some sort of an order where her former partner couldn't come towards her, but that was going to finish in about 5 days or so. And she told me in very broken English, because we don't speak the same language, she told me that she actually doesn't know what to do because she called the women's aid and she doesn't really understand what they're saying. And the police, they helped as much as they could. She went to the council, they said something, but she didn't know what. So she went with a friend who also didn't understand and so on. So I said, oh, okay, it's fine. I'll deal with it, because I've seen so many ads that say, if you are going through this, you just call the hotline and it would all be fine. And I didn't get through to them. I called for 3 hours that evening. Nobody picked up, and I assume they are overworked. So I couldn't get through with them. It was 8 p.m. at the time. So I said, okay, it's too late. So let's see what I can do. So I called institutions in turn. So the council, obviously out of hours, they said, call the police. I called the police, who said, call the council. Called the council and said, oh, right, call the council hotline for domestic violence, who didn't have people working at the time. So they said, this is not an emergency. So if you have an emergency, call the women's aid hotline, who didn't pick up. So it was a circle. There was nothing we could have done. And finally, she went back home and we called again in the morning. And that was just one example, but it took about 3 days until she got to safety. And then she finally got with her baby into a house. So that was great, but she wasn't provided with any help. So she didn't have food. It took me 2 days to realize that she actually didn't eat. I didn't know that. So all sorts of things like this. If you're from the outside, you think it's done. There are commercials, there are ads everywhere to say, if you have a problem, you call this hotline. But actually, it's not that easy. And yeah.
It's just before I go back to Janaya, because I know she'll be able to respond a bit to some of the things you said. Is she safe now? The person that you were trying to help, is she safe now? You're still in touch with her?
She is safe, but not in the way we would have liked to be. So unfortunately, because she couldn't cope with anything, she ended up in a new relationship and she moved away. I've just recently spoke to her and she said, all is okay. It's just bumps of new relationships. So I don't really know what has happened and I don't really have connections to her anymore.
Okay, thanks so much, Julia, for your contribution. I'm going to come back to Janaya before I go to Elizabeth Devereaux, who's going to talk a bit more about women and women-owned businesses and things. But there's some important things in there, Janaya, about access to these services. We know they're really super stretched.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. And I think you raised some important points as well about the experience of women, but particularly as a service which represents Black and minoritized women and migrant women. I think this has been really at the forefront of our mind with some of the things that you mentioned in terms of both women who don't speak English as a first language, women who would not be entitled to support from the councils due to the no recourse to public funds condition. So the no recourse to public funds condition is a condition applied to those in the UK, primarily without indefinite leave to remain, but it covers an array of people. It could be those on domestic, who are domestic workers, those who are entrepreneurs. It could be asylum seekers and undocumented women who are here on spousal visas. But essentially what it means is that at the point of crisis for many women, when they want to flee in a relationship, they're not entitled to universal credit. They're not entitled to sort of forms of welfare, which really provide an essential safety net and are a lifeline for women when they want to escape abuse. No recourse to public funds means that in 2017, statistics from Women's Aid found that 4 in 5 Black and minoritized women were turned away from refuges because they don't have universal credit to cover the cost of their stay. So that experience you expressed, unfortunately, in terms of calling the National Domestic Violence Helpline, reaching out to refuges and being either dismissed or delayed is something that has existed long before the crisis, and which we've been shouting about with the government for years now, particularly as the domestic abuse bill is going through Parliament, but which has really been brought to the fore in the coronavirus crisis. And I think what was said earlier in terms of it goes beyond, I think, neglect and incompetence, particularly with regards to migrant women. There has been a willful refusal to lift no recourse to public funds, to put an end to some of the hostile environment policies, which really trap women within their homes, where it's not only a case of we don't know where to reach out, we don't know if the person on the end of the phone will understand us, but when we do reach out, you know, in that opportunity, that potentially that one chance to call the council or to reach out to a service, we are then told, unfortunately, you have no recourse to public funds. So in the case of Manchester, stay home and stay vigilant. These are the experiences that migrant women are facing, because there's a double barrier there, where not only they're women, they're Black and minoritized women who are facing the brunt of the hostile environment and sort of Home Office policies as well.
Thank you, Janae. I think that the domestic abuse bill has gone through the Commons, has now hit the Lords, but it still has that gap, doesn't it? It doesn't.
Absolutely. And I think when we're talking about, you know, this idea of, you know, could the government, is this understandable? Is it reasonable that the government didn't know? This was going alongside at the same time where the domestic abuse bill was being held as this landmark opportunity to transform the response to domestic abuse. You know, this, according to the government's own rhetoric, was at the forefront of their mind. This is, you know, a principal piece of legislation to transform how we respond to abuse in our society. So the idea that that was happening on the one hand, and on the other hand, we were having planning meetings around COVID, which had absolutely no regard for that legislation, is just staggering. And where we are now was entirely predictable and preventable.
Yeah. Thanks, Janaea. So we've got about 15 minutes left in the session. I want to make sure that I come now to Elizabeth Diaferra, because there is, even within the economic package, there's been a sort of gendered bias to the types of businesses that have been talked about or prioritised. So I want to come to that next. And then Phoebe is raising some important points about the women's health services that I'd like to have a go into as well before we come to the end of the session. So Elizabeth, I can see your screen, but I can't see your face. I don't know if you're there. Can you hear us?
I am here and I can hear you, but I don't know why my video isn't working. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry, we can listen to your dulcet tones. I was interested in the link that you posted about the sort of dominance of male type businesses in the economic recovery package.
No, I remember back in the summer when businesses were opening, that actually there was a real lack of, I suppose, beauticians, etc. But equally, you know, you could have a beard trim, but you actually couldn't have a facial. And it's sort of like, and I just remember my daughter, who was sort of has friends in the industry as well, but was sort of like, well, why is this so sort of like male gendered? And I remember there was quite a lot of articles at the time, which I haven't found. But also one of the points that I think is really key is that a lot of women are freelancers, and we haven't been supported in the sort of like from the freelance side from any of the financial packages, and or if you have been self-employed, you've had to been doing it for 3 years, and a lot of people haven't been doing it for 3 years. But it's just across, it seemed very male how it was sort of like picked which businesses were at the time.
So is it the case, Elizabeth, that if you're a freelancer and you haven't been self-employed you haven't got your sort of, I suppose, like tax records or whatever for 3 years, did that endure throughout the whole period of lockdown, that you didn't have access to furlough at all?
Yeah, definitely. Wow. You have to have 3 years of sort of like being a sole trader or freelance. So if you'd only just gone on to something, you know, it didn't work. So
you got nothing?
Yeah.
Wow, thank you very much. And I
think it's sort of like across when you think about all the different industries, creative industries, but also, I mean, one of the other areas that particularly you think about sort of like how weddings has suffered and event planning, and, you know, and predominantly female industries, and sort of from, it's just a massive spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the events industry has been completely decimated. Yeah. That's majority women too. Thank you very much for your contribution. Let's try and use the last sort of 10 minutes or so, if we can, on the question of health. I'm going to go to my colleague Phoebe, who has been talking about, you know, we mentioned earlier on and in Jeremy's opening about the rules around pregnancy, when you're having a baby, you can't have your partner come in to be there with you. And then I think they changed the rules that you could be in just for the very moment of giving birth, but then you had to kind of chip out again. And that's obviously enormously stressful and painful. But Phoebe, you've raised a different point about the rise in eating disorders, particularly among young women.
Yeah, so I actually reported on it for the Mirror back in, it was April that I started talking to people, and kind of by May that it went online. And I don't know if you've seen, have had a huge, genuinely just distressing increase in calls. I just had a quick check. It's now about 162% more calls than they were receiving last year over the pandemic period. And I spoke to the director of ORI, which is a eating disorder clinic in London, and she was telling me that across the country, people being discharged from inpatient facilities. So they were going home, they were being stuck at home. If you remember through the summer, the rhetoric of the supermarket, going to buy food during the pandemic was incredibly stressful, essential items only. It was not an easy experience. There was reduced movement. That is incredibly distressing for some people who have eating disorders and rely on that kind of form of exercise to support them. And in general, it just seems to not be in the news enough, because if you didn't know already, anorexia has the highest mortality of any mental illness. It's incredibly dangerous to people, and it just kind of fell below the wayside. And of course, this affects men as well, but disproportionately it does affect women. And it just seems to be one of those things that fell by the wayside. Where was the support? BE have been really struggling, but I haven't seen any active work to support them. When I spoke to the Department for Health, they said 5 million had been given to mental health. That's not enough, and it's not specific.
So 5 million specifically for eating disorder services?
No, so I can read you said communities, talking therapies and children and young people services are deploying innovative digital tools to provide ongoing support, and we recently provided 5 million to leading mental health charities to help them expand and reach the most in need. So it was, a general statement, and that's what they gave me, and it might have increased by then. Sorry, this was my reporting back in May, but I'd be interested to look again and see if they've done specific support to charities like BEAT, because from what I've seen, they've been really struggling, and they're a fantastic charity, but it's similar in America, and the charities and eating disorders there, and they're having similar problems.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Phoebe. Let's go to Ella Devereaux, who's had a personal experience of being referred from talking therapies, I think, and that being difficult. Are you there, Ella?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Hello.
Yeah, just to add to what Phoebe said, really, I applied for therapy, I think, into September 2019, and I was finally at the top of the waiting list, which we already know is such a long waiting list, NHS therapy. And because of COVID, I was told that I would have to wait. So I didn't actually access it until September. And then when I finally got the call, they were like, you can't come in. We're cutting the sessions down to 6. It was supposed to be 10 to 12.
Right.
And I mean, it was fine. It was over the phone, but it's just, just to add to what Phoebe was saying and the conversations we've been having. I mean, services were already underfunded and stretched. And I think COVID really sort of accentuated that.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much for sharing your perspective, Ella. I'm loving your big lips on the background.
Thank you.
Good statement Zoom background, I think, is always strong. I might come back, if I may, briefly to Mandu, because I think really the sort of key things for me, and certainly in terms of our sort of follow-up reporting, is this thing about chronology and announcements, and the fact that it was not an ambush and that these are deliberate choices. Those two, it's hard not to conclude, in agreement with what you've been saying, that this is a sort of dereliction of duty or neglect or whatever the words. In terms of policy alternatives, it would be helpful, and my colleague Tessa sort of mentioned, what are the other packages of things that we could have said, okay, not that, but this? What are the things that we've decided not to do? That would have made a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, there's so many different layers to it. You could argue that where expenditure to address some of the issues that were belatedly recognized came, actually started to flow, the amounts were paltry. I think it's taken the piss to too far down the line allocate £2 million to a national domestic abuse crisis, which was actually just for the helplines. And the reason I think this is a really important line of inquiry, you should do the chronology, but also look at the contrast between how much money was spent on different things at different times. And really, very simply, when they got the message and realized stuff needed to be done, the response wasn't of a sufficient order of magnitude. And I do not buy the argument that, the purse strings are tight. That is, forgive my French, bullshit. The purse strings were not tight when contracts were being awarded to cronies to deliver world-beating track and trace systems that never materialized. The purse strings were not tight in the days before the comprehensive spending review, when it was revealed that the defense budget of all things was going to get the biggest boost of expenditure, whilst simultaneously delivering a shattering blow to public sector workers by freezing their pay. And this is not gender neutral. Freezing the pay of the majority of public sector workers disproportionately affects women. It is also a sign, in a way, of lessons not being learned. This crisis, and this is where the social policy thing comes in, you've got to take a step back and evaluate what matters, what holds our society together. 77% of healthcare workers are women. 83% of social care workers are women. 92% of childcare workers are women. Those are the people on whom we were relying as the crisis unfolds. If that doesn't tell you how essential those people are to the fabric of society, I don't know what will. And if they are essential, you have to have an investment policy. If you're serious about building prosperity and resilience into our country, you have to have an investment policy that acknowledges those things, that supports those sectors. Investing in construction's fine. There's nothing wrong with that per se. But actually, if you want to create jobs and if you want to stimulate the economy so that all sectors can thrive, you've got to invest in social infrastructure. Childcare. Childcare would mean more women can go back to work. More women going back to work means greater tax receipts. It means they have more disposable income to spend in the sectors that are suffering: retail, food and leisure, which, by the way, disproportionately employ women too. So what we have is a short-sightedness, a laziness, and ideological decision-making that's informing the social policy.
Yeah, thanks, Mandu. I can see Tessa making the same point you make about childcare. I should know the answer to this, and I don't, but with the Tessa may know. Actually, Tessa, are you there? You're talking about your 280 billion goes into, in inverted commas, supporting businesses, but childcare as a sector was completely excluded from that. Is that right?
The point I was trying to make, this is probably one you've heard me make before, because I do bang on about it a bit, but I think there are two issues with childcare. Mandy's point about the service industries being so heavily reliant on female labour. So recognising what we needed to do to sort of unleash the power of women in our recovery in two ways. One, I've talked about this till I'm blue in the face for the last 20 years as a working mother. The double taxation situation on childcare is totally unacceptable. As a former employer of a childcare professional, that cost always came out of my post-tax income. Their gross pay came out of my post-tax income. There is a single thing that could justify that if we, as Mandy says, are looking to build a social fabric that supports more than half our population in an economic and in an economic sense. So my point was, with 280 billion pounds being flooded into the economic recovery of this country, completely bypassing the one thing that allows women to work, which is access to affordable childcare, it does feel like there were very few women in the room for that flipping conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks very much, Tessa. Always nice to see you. Emma J makes a good point. With 1 minute to go, I might just try and squeeze it in. Emma J, if you're there, but your advice to us in terms of our follow-up work is to follow the money trail from the announcement through the system, wherever it would go. What are the organisations, who are the people, and then where does it end up? I can't imagine that's a quick bit of journalistic inquiry, but it's certainly a very important one. So thank you very much to Emma for that. I was going to briefly go back to Jo, but I'm not sure we've got time because I don't want to overrun, because the Young Women's Trust in particular have been calling for, she says, referring to her notes, a sex-specific plan for jobs, in particular, you know, a sort of specifically designed to protect jobs, particularly of young women. So Jo, if you're still there, would you mind just giving us a sort of idiot's guide, 60-second whistle-stop tour of what a sex-specific plan for jobs might look like?
Sure. It would be a plan that recognises the problems that have happened in the past. It would be a plan that recognises that the apprenticeship scheme, for example, had just as many men as women, but young women were locked out of better paid roles. They weren't able to access apprenticeships on a part-time basis. There was a lot of gender segregation, a lack of understanding of the outside responsibilities that women disproportionately have. So we need a jobs plan that really puts women and young women's needs at its heart, that breaks down gender barriers and provides every support and opportunity to young women, and really looks at those sectors which are increasingly being affected, like retail and hospitality, where women and young women are disproportionately to be found and whose jobs are disproportionately at risk now.
Thanks, Jo. Details of them will be sort of on the Young Women's Trust website. I think it would be worth us having a look at that too. Thank you so much to everybody who's contributed to this session, of course, to Janaya, to Mandu, to Jo for heroically stepping in at the last minute, and to Jeremy as well for a really, I think, motivating and precise opening statement. I think we've uncovered or certainly homed in on some specific things that I think we need to take forward to make this inquiry sort of have the teeth that we want for it to have. And thank you, of course, everybody who's weighed in the chat and come on screen to contribute and share their experiences. The next session starts in 50 minutes. It's actually the last session of this sort of investigative, open contributing phase of the inquiry, where we're looking at the healthcare industry as opposed to the NHS and the way that has responded and adapted and supported or otherwise the handling of the pandemic. So, oh, actually, my colleague has just said it doesn't start till 2 o'clock. So we all get to go and have some lunch, which is nice. Please do come back though for the final session of the day, and thank you very much to everybody. Bye-bye.